my name is Cristiano Codagnone. As you can see from the affiliation, I have a double affiliation with the University of Milan, the Department of Social and Political Science, and the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, this university, the Department of Media and Communication. And I'm also, together with the university, we funded this university spin-off called Open Evidence that has helped the University of Bergen in organizing this event. This is a paper I wrote with two co-authors. One is an economist, Francesco. The other is a social psychologist. And I am originally a sociologist, although also trained in economics. And we worked together also at the GRC in the European Commission some years ago. And we have worked many times for the European Commission in some applied policy work. So this is a reflection that is, as an anthropologist, Clifford Geertz would put it, as a near experience knowledge. I mean, we have come to this work after also having experience, being expert inside the policy-making process. There is a version of this paper, which is a working paper, the longer version. There are 10 copies here if you want to have a deeper look. And hopefully will be soon published in the Journal of Institutional Economics. It is a paper that has formalized, so there is a modeling application, but I will try to give you just the qualitative part, because basically we've worked, sociologists and psychologists, providing the behavioral ideas and the analysis of institutional analysis, and then the economist has simplified and stylized and made this into a model. So the aim of the paper is to build a positive theory of the relationship between evidence and policy. Positive in the sense, you know, how it is used in economics. And in doing this, we follow and generalize an approach by Fischer and Eggers that defines three aspects that any form of policy requires. First, a normative choice. And this is already important because we are not assuming that there is already defined best choice, but there is a normative choice. So it's already a political choice there. A descriptive account of the behavior, and then a prescriptive identification of the gap between desire and actual account. And we contribute to the discussion on populism and post-truthism, showing that there are polarized views for and against experts that are generally biased, at least according to our analysis. Because our model show it's a simulation, so without data. I mean, it's a thought experiment with numerical example, but based on the hypothesis of the model. But our model showed that different institutional arrangements have different performance depending on the configuration of the problem that you are facing as a policymaker. So first we define a normative criterion based on cost-benefit analysis and the value of a piece of information. This is the main limit of the paper. We assume, for the moment, we study policymakers for how they should act. Okay? So the further step is to make the model more complex and study policymakers how they actually act and how they are influenced by interest, emotion, values, etc. But for the moment, we establish this criteria, that the policymaker asks information to citizen or expert, making a cost-benefit analysis of the accuracy of the information he or she received. Okay? So as a second step, this is the normative part, this is the descriptive part. We apply some behavioral rules to a standard game theoretic tool to study the Nash equilibria of an interaction between expert and citizen in providing information for a decision maker. Then, using numerical example, in our model, we simulate different situations and try to see how three different institutional arrangements that we call evidence-based policy, deliberative governance, and negotiated conflict, which I explain in a minute, they differ in terms of how heavily they rely on expert or citizen, and we test how they perform in terms of providing accurate information for the policymaker to decide. So evidence-based policy is, what counts is what works, is also an attempt to expel politics from policy making. randomized control trial, meta-reviews. It's the science or it's the evidence that tells me what I have to do, trying to expel any form of distraction from the process. Then we have what we call, obviously in the paper there is a lot of literature quoted, I'm not quoting it here, deliberative policy making against the scienticization of politics, so the involvement of citizens in the process. And then what we call maybe the old-fashioned social democratic model, because in a way Blair with evidence-based policy wanted to remove this, is the negotiated conflict, when there is an adversarial system in which both parties are biased, probably, but they fight against each other openly, you know, and actually the role of the policymaker would be like the one of the judge. Or, you know, also the model of the negotiated economy of an old tradition. So, in the game, we assume that under the arrangement of evidence-based policy, the policymakers select the opinion of experts but raise the sanction if there is a detection of lie. The same with the citizen. In the negotiated conflict, they put one against the other, so there is an increased sensitivity to the counterpart. These are the strategic aspects of the game theoretic application. Now, what I'm presenting, what we wrote in this, is a formalized version of what we have done in this book. And actually, I was fortunate to have a preface by Andrea Saltelli. The book is in Italian, but we will soon translate into English. And we studied more qualitatively and reconstructing case study, looking at policy making beyond the evidence-based policy approach, beyond only evidence, but considering three dimensions: evidence, interest, and values. And so the final chapter of this book is also the qualitative account that we now have formalized in this paper. And as an example, what we learned also, what I learned from one of the presentations by Andrea on sensitivity auditing, is that now the evidence has become the currency of lobbying and is used to make policymakers intervene or not intervene. And I think this is the other work I've done out of this, is the platform economies, where the sharing economy, concentrated interests manage to produce an under-intervention by the regulators. And I was working in the GRC at the time when the dossier on the sharing economy came out. So we introduced the concept of the policy space. And we, considering these three dimensions, we define the behaviors of different actors. It is a re-elaboration of themes that are present in the post-normal science. So we have values. If someone has not clear the tornado versus abortion politics, I will explain it, but this is a classic in Pilk. And also the behavioral perspective that group formation, group identity, creates behavioral bias, the so-called politically motivated reasoning. When belonging to a group is important, even if you give me more evidence, I don't believe you. I remain part of that group, for instance, that is against the vaccine. And then interest, where we make a big distinction between, and it's an old-fashioned distinction of Mancur-Olson 1965, between strategic versus diffuse interest. Strategic means concentrated, specific, organized interest, versus diffuse interest, the interest of like the consumers. Okay, so, and finally, the last dimension is the epistemic uncertainty, where I don't have to add a lot. I mean, this is an inspiration that comes from post-normal science, of course, but also other evidence. So we have a space where obviously we put rents there, so it means strategic interest, and the zero is where there is diffuse. We have here high degree of uncertainty, of epistemic uncertainty, and here we have low. And then we have value conflict high, and here low. And we have put three examples: the sugar and arteriosclerotic vascular diseases, another intuition that on which I'm in debt to Andrea as a case, immigration and vaccines, and I'll explain a bit better about them later. So rents is like no, sorry. We should have put there concentrated interest. So rents is already almost an implication. If there are concentrated interests, there are rents to be protected. Okay, so it is a bit, yeah, you're right. So we assume this. The most complex situation is what you have: concentrated interest, value conflict, and epistemic uncertainty. How does this affect expert and citizen? Remember, we are assuming the policymakers are rational and they are asking information to expert and citizen, and they have to evaluate the accuracy of this information. So if there are strategic interests, the impact on expert is very high, because obviously interest groups would like to increase uncertainty. Imagine the famous book, The Merchant of Doubts. And for them, the evidence by the expert is very valuable. So the expert may be captured by the specific interest. If there is value conflict, this has less impact on expert and is higher impact on citizen, because citizen may fall prey of a group thing and sticking to the group, even in the face of evidence showing that their choice is not correct. Finally, epistemic uncertainty is important for experts. Under condition of high epistemic uncertainty, experts can feel freer to just manipulate evidence or be light-hearted about evidence, because there is less of a risk of being refuted. And for the expert, their name, their reputation is important. So, oh, sorry, I just can't mix. For instance, in the sugar and heart disease, you raise 5 minutes? No. Okay, so I'm almost done. In the case of sugar and heart disease, we are in the condition of high epistemic uncertainty, value consensus, and the presence of a concentrated group. Why? Because epidemiology is, to some extent, a social science. I mean, there is a high level of uncertainty in epistemic uncertainty. However, there was a consensus on the fact that obesity was not good for health, and there was a high rents. Okay, who get the blame for rise of a cardiovascular disease? So the story tells us that the sugar industry engaged scholars that made systematic review, pushing, all the blame on fat and not on sugar. We found out that in 2016, correct? Yeah. I look at my master. So in this case, we have this situation. The case of this is one of the most complicated cases, because we have the three things together. And we take immigration. There is no evidence, at least experimental or quasi-experimental evidence, on the counterclaims that they pay our pension or they still have jobs. There is no evidence conclusive of this. At the same time, there is a fight between multiculturalism and xenophobia, and we have strategic interests because there are redistributive effects within country and now between country, if you see the fight between Italy and the rest of Europe about the immigrants. So this is the condition, the most difficult condition. Now, because I don't have time, but you take me a face value, and if needed, I show you. We run the model with this hypothesis, and the results is the following. When experts are at risk of being influenced by structural strategic interest groups, the deliberative frame, so the involvement of citizens, moderates such risk. The evidence-based policy frame is best suited when there is epistemic uncertainty, a value conflict, where the public can be misled. In presence of both value conflict and strategic interest, both the deliberative approach and evidence-based policy do not produce the best, they don't reach a Nash equilibrium. So then you can be critical about this. But they don't produce the best outcome. Instead, the negotiated conflict frames does. In the condition, the last condition, the one of immigration, there is an under-optimal equilibrium. The quality of information provided by both expert and citizen is bad. But in this context, still, the deliberative approach, so the involvement of citizens, perform better than evidence-based policy or negotiated conflict. These are the conclusion, and like a black box, but you can read the paper, and there is all the mathematical demonstration on the model, the numerical simulation. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I work at the University of Bergen. and I'm going to tell you a little bit about, this is the point where you're wondering, why is she putting such a cute picture, besides it being cute? It happens to me, my daughter. It's a little bit, as a parent, not totally fulfilling because it's out of focus. And the reason for the out of focus is because she is toddling. So I'm alluding to the title of my presentation, Crawling to Convergence. I'm going to make a couple connections to this metaphor. But when I'm talking about convergence and this idea of, it's also an academic question, why do humans start walking to begin with? When you get to be an expert crawler, you're really good at crawling, why present yourself to this new risk, this new world of bipedalization? I want you to keep that metaphor in the back of your head because I'm going to return to it. But first I'm going to introduce you quickly to this Center for Digital Life in Norway. So this is a program under the Biotech 2021 program of the Research Council of Norway. And one of their strategic aspects is this idea of the virtual center, and you have different hubs with different institutions in Norway, but also that they're doing convergence. This is this idea of convergence for innovation. Okay. This idea of convergence happens, is a bit problematic in terms of postnormal science, and this is kind of one of the theses that I'll introduce you to. From the strategic document of why they want to do this type of convergence, the mission of Digital Life Convergence for Innovation is to facilitate a major shift toward a concerted use of conceptual, methodological, technological elements from the life sciences in engineering, with significant societal utility and value, and methods characterizing mature engineering disciplines. So this is basically getting the life scientists and engineering to collaborate better for society. But who then determines the societal value? Who determines who the extended peer community is? So it's constrained within the life sciences. To this effect, the Center for Digital Life don't explicitly have this type of extended peer community peer review, but they have responsible research and innovation as an add-on. So that is how I work. I work as a responsible research and innovation coordinator, if you will, in the project called DCOD, and I'll introduce you to this project. But the DCOD project is really based on ocean health. Now this is a kind of stylized view of how we would like to think that humans and the ocean interact. Very pristine, very simple, but this is the reality for much of the industrialized world. You guys are probably familiar with the idea of plastics and microplastics in the ocean. This, basically marine plastics and macro plastic litter has become quite visible in our own beaches. In Norway, all the way up to the northern part of Svalbard in the Arctic Ocean at 80 degrees north, we're seeing plastic. We know more and more that the health of the ocean is also connected to humans in many different ways, different facets, and this becomes a big global challenge. So the thesis for this presentation specifically is that this science for convergence, it's problematic for us working with global challenges in this frame of ocean and human health, because it doesn't imply the postnormal literacy that's needed. And in the Center for Digital Life, we have a very explicit teaching component of teaching us PhD students and postdocs on how to do this convergence research. So my action then, my normative action working within this in-reach, so you were all familiar with societal outreach, that kind of science communication, talking to the public. And I like to define my practice more as the in-reach within the network, understanding how the scientists communicate within their own collaboration, but also teaching students about how things should be done in a normative fashion. Okay, but then maybe this idea of convergence is just kind of a Norwegian relic or something, but so I did a bit of a literature review. And the idea of convergence from the National Science Foundation is, again, looking at societal needs, but within a very distinct life science community. So it's not about framing problems with stakeholders. It's not about co-design or co-production. It's very much within that epistemic network of the life sciences. So even from an North American point of view, this definition of convergence still holds. There is no post-normal aspects of it. The peer community is constrained to the intellectuals, in essence. So how do I deal with this, if you will? So I want to introduce you a little bit to the Decod project. So there's some fish people here, like Mimi and Tony, but for the non-fish people, you might well say, okay, why do you use cod? Cod, it tastes good, but where does the convergence part, where is the innovation in it? And there's a lot of reasons why to use cod in this project. One is because cod has a very important, it has a high value culturally, historically, economically in Norway. But also cod is a very interesting environmental indicator. When you think of it's a fatty fish, it has a very fatty liver. And these persistent organic pollutants, POPs, and other toxic substances, pollution, act as a literal magnet to the cod liver. So the cod liver, if you open it up and can look at it from a systems toxicology point of view, you can say a lot about the environment in which it's living. So you can use it as this kind of canary in a coal mine. If the cod liver is healthy, then its environment can also be healthy as proxy. But how can you really show that from a really hardcore life sciences point of view? So we're really talking about systems toxicology and this idea of systems biology. And this is where this convergence is coming in. And you can have a lot of different disciplinary connections. You have the biology, the mathematics, and the bioinformatics. And because of the RRI, the Responsible Research and Innovation part, that was mandated by the program that they had to have. So it was a forced marriage. I was actually asked 3 hours before the deadline to engage as the RRI coordinator. By virtue of that, we can include social sciences and humanities. So the research question that the Decod project has, this is a 40 million euro, not euro, that would be impressive, kroner, Norwegian kroner project, so in the first generation of the Center for Digital Life funding. Now this is a bit of how we work. So these are some of the PhD students doing biological sampling. They have exposed cod to bad things in the water in an experimental setting, but also put cod into the natural environment on sites where we have been dumping garbage in Bergen the past 50 years. And some of these substances are seeping out through the sand, and we put cod cages there to see what happens to the cod. And what they do then is they take all these different organ samples and look at the liver and try to see if they find these substances in them. Because if they do, that's very interesting to understand how the genome has reacted to it. So does cod have genetic response to how they deal with these? And in order to do that, there's a lot of very general mathematical modeling going on, also in different ways. Bringing computer science and ideas of typology, bringing in different theories. A societal perspective, but also a critique of how the project is actually working. So how do you, biologist, give your data to the mathematician? What happens in that transaction? How do you see your data being used? How is the mathematician looking at your data? And from a mathematical point of view, what type of biological data is useful for you when you go in? So a lot of that in reach, a lot of that in negotiation there. But to look a little bit more about the RRI aspect and this kind of problematic that, okay, we are working in a post-normal context, even though the program basically says that we're not. I also feel, if you will, moral obligation to expose the students to understand that what do you do when you have high systems uncertainties? What do you do when your policymaker says, tell me how healthy the ocean is? You can't always just give a number. We won't be able to produce that type of knowledge. How do we produce different types of knowledge? And I really like this idea of the T-shaped researcher. Maybe if you haven't heard about it before, I'll show you the reference. But the idea that we're educating PhD students to be experts in their field is an extremely important part of their education. but they also need to understand, especially in these convergence networks, how their expertise connects to other people's expertise. Not just out in society or societal values, that's part of it, but also within the network. That's part of my InReach practice. So this was kind of inspired by, there's a nice editorial in Nature that looks at, in business, they use this type of T-shaped business person, this idea of T-shape, that you have to really know your field well, but understand how to connect your field to others, especially when like these big grand challenges, SDGs, for example, Sustainable Development Goals, are concerned. And there's an interesting figure here, this journey to a T, because it is very iterative, and is this very much, if you remember my metaphor, this toddling. So before we've been expert crawlers. We've been really good at our single disciplines, really nice scientific advances, and now we're asked to start extending our peer community, essentially, if you look within these convergence networks. We're supposed to get out of our comfort zone and start getting towards this idea of a constructive dialogue. One way that the Decode project has tried to put this into practice is that there's bi-weekly meetings. They're not mandatory, but we generally have a very good attendance. In Bergen, I think we have about 25 people involved in the project, including 10 PhDs. And this has been a way for us to kind of start talking about how the different work packages and the different fields are kind of working. But there has been a problem with these bi-weekly meetings. And one of the problems is this idea of a common language. So I've had, through my RRI interactions with the students, I asked them to reflect, okay, how is it going? What do you think about your own practice and your own PhD in light of everything else? And it kept coming up again and again that I don't get anything from the bi-weekly meetings. I sit there, I listen to the mathematicians show their model. As a biologist, I still don't know what they're trying to say. And this is 2 years into the project. And this came up again, and third time, and then I was like, okay, this obviously isn't working. The students also said that, there is a hierarchy here. You have the senior scientists that they know what they're talking about, and they're talking across the students. So we're designing a journal club that will be only for the students starting in January, where the students are sitting down, they'll present a paper, we read it together, the students have to write questions, and we talk about it. So it'll be much more explicit where the language exists and where it doesn't, and how to do that a little bit better. I also have RI walks, and the PhD students are mandated, or it's mandatory that they write a monthly blog report for the website. And most of the students have no idea what they want to blog about. It's a different type of writing. It's not traditional scientific writing. You're supposed to put your ideas out there for the public. And we have different, you can go to decode.no and see, for example, we've had topics like, what's it like to be a mother in science? There was a postdoc in Oslo who was, she didn't know what she should write about. And we had a three-way Skype. So me at home, because I was on maternity leave, another one was at home with her sick kid, and then she had her baby on her lap. And we talked 15 minutes, what should we write about, what should we write about, until we're like, okay, obviously mothers in science. That's just an example of these blog posts, but also I have a methodology that I don't have time to go in, but a deep self-reflection where I videotaped the student engaging with the public at a public stand at a science festival, and they watched themselves watching themselves. So I taped them 2 times. And then we have an interactive survey that we discuss. But that's one-on-one practice. So that's that. Then quickly, because I have 1 more minute left, I think, this is just to repeat the responsible research and innovation as a social scientific license for this meaningful, if you will, postnormal science capacity building to really start getting them to reflect about what they know and what they don't know. And then I think that really implicitly I'm going towards this post-normal convergence, this idea that convergence is very, very interesting from a scientific point of view, but also that idea of making it relevant. Just really quickly to end, this is a really interesting paper for anyone who's interested. For many, many years in academia, it wasn't solved why children start walking, but when they looked at the data, and there's a very interesting experimental setup, they found that it's a myth that it's risky to start walking. They actually fall less when they walk, and they cover more ground. So even though you're an expert crawler, you fall just as much because you're still trying to reach up and stuff as these expert walkers. So I think there's a lot to be said about this idea of interdisciplinarity, this idea of convergence. They ask the question, why wouldn't we walk when we know that you cover more ground? And you can make a metaphor that why wouldn't we converge? Why wouldn't we converge post-normally? We could cover more ground by doing it, but I think it's very important that this is embedded in the education of the PhD student. So thank you very much.
I graduated as a theoretical physicist and a nuclear physicist. But I moved, well, to philosophy, science, worked myself into postnormal science and also art. Not because I thought I was crazy, but I thought that I was completely unsatisfied with the way science was used in policy and in the market, and of course also the nuclear case, as a very controversial case, made me to ask the Belgian Nuclear Research Center to set up a transdisciplinary research group to study that case. But at the University of Ghent, I research global governance from the perspective of intellectual capacity building and human rights. So my talk is The Politics of Hypothesis, an inquiry into the ethics of scientific assessment. Basically, what I'm telling here is published into two book chapters. The first one is more or less the framework. The second one is what I'm talking about here. These books are too expensive, so if you really want to have my chapter, just give me like a sign and I send them to you. I should not say this, of course, but okay, all right. I'm going to say something about Fukushima, a case that we have been studying quite extensively and intensively, also in Fukushima itself, talking to citizens and policymakers over there. Then I say something about what the problem is according to me, present some critical visions, and I come to a conclusion. So Fukushima, I think this pictures in a very good way what is actually happening there. I mean, the social crisis is total in Fukushima. Nobody trusts anybody anymore. And if you see this picture is also a metaphor and a hard reality of that situation. You see intervention workers wearing protective clothing, a child obviously very scared, also standing there as if it's arrested. That's really a metaphor for the stigmatization of the population over there. So in May 2016, this paper appeared in the journal Epidemiology. It's basically a scientist who says that he can now already observe a rise in thyroid cancer with children in the Fukushima era. So what did the government do? Because they suspected that this could be an effect of the nuclear accident, they systematically screened everybody younger than 18 in the affected area. So they measure the thyroid and see if something is visible there. This conclusion of this scientist has been contested, obviously by TEPCO and the Japanese government, because they don't want to see these results appearing, but also by scientists, also in the same journal. This guy said that an excess of thyroid cancer it has been detected by ultrasound among children and adolescents in Fukushima within 4 years of the release, and is unlikely to be explained by screening search. I explained that immediately. But one of the critiques, for instance, against that scientific finding is this one from a professor from Cambridge, and I quote, "The evidence suggests that the current prevalence of thyroid cancer found by ultrasound screening in Fukushima represents a normal finding. It doesn't exclude the possibility that a very small number of cancers may be radiation-induced. An increase due to radiation will probably be detectable in the future among the youngest at exposure from the most exposed areas, but it will be much smaller than the increase seen after Chernobyl." What is the critique summarized? It's threefold. The scientific critique, again, not a political critique, the scientific critique. First one is that it's too early to draw conclusions. In Chernobyl, we have seen a rise in thyroid cancer in children, but only 7, 8, 9 years after the accident. So is it only a matter of waiting? Yes and no, because the radioactivity released in Fukushima was much smaller than in Chernobyl. But the third critique is very interesting and important. There's some kind of falsification of your results when you do systematic screening. Simply said, if you would compare the number of thyroid cancers you detect by simply counting the people who go to the doctor with complaints and diagnosed as positive on the one hand, and the number of thyroid cancers you detect when you do systematic screening, it's about 150 times more, 150. Thyroid cancer is a very slowly growing cancer. It mainly affects children or put children in danger. When we all grow old, 1 in 3 of us has thyroid cancer. So what is this telling us? By doing good science, doing systematic screening, you actually produce so much noise on the result you actually want to measure. So which means that, as a scientist trying to prove, or at least find out, that there is thyroid cancer or not, you remain completely perplexed because of the noise. So in Fukushima, this ongoing discussion is a scientific discussion. It's relevant and needed, but it would benefit from a serene and accommodating atmosphere, you understand, and that atmosphere is not present at the moment. And I quote from my paper, both hypotheses, excess thyroid cancer due to accident or no excess thyroid cancer after the accident, are used in support of specific political, social, and economic interests. And meanwhile, science, when asked for advice, will seemingly remain completely perplexed for a time to come. Last but not least, one has to take into account the possibility that the truth about whether there is more thyroid cancer in children in Fukushima due to the nuclear accident or not will never be revealed. Okay, I wrote about that, also about that case in a paper that is free downloadable. I guess these presentations will be available on the website of the conference later on. I'm not sure about that. Okay, science in the area of uncertainty. What is actually the problem? Today, many scientific hypotheses are granted with a social, political, commercial function. They are prematurely released from the laboratory without full support from empirical evidence, but with a specific task: to warn the world about dangerous situations or evolutions, or to inform it about promising trends and capacities. And in many cases, they are produced as if-then hypotheses on explicit request of politics or the market. What kind of science do we talk about? Of course, it's science that matters for social justice. Science aims to deliver guidance to policy concerned with social well-being. And one of the obvious examples that was also area of research for postnormal science is dealing with risk-inherent technologies applied in for food, energy, healthcare, and construction, and so on. From the paper, the more fundamental problem with science that aims to advise policy today is not the problem of strategic manipulation of scientific advice by politics, civil society, or the market, or by science itself per se, but rather the challenge of dealing with the lack of evidence in situations where politics, civil society, or the market need that evidence to eventually, urgently inform, criticize, or justify specific actions or practices. All concerned actors in these cases are left with nothing more than underdetermined scientific hypotheses. And in the absence of evidence that would facilitate straightforward judgment, consensus, and consequent action, these hypotheses have themselves become the end products of science. And society in general, and science, politics, civil society, and the market in particular, have no other choice than to somehow deal with them in a responsible way. And of course, we have to take into account that these occurrences of scientific perplexity are not only a concern for the scientific community. On the contrary, they're first and foremost a challenge for democracy, because proper scientific policy advice is an intrinsic quality of democracy instead of science itself. Now we know that there are critical visions on what science is and should be. We have the more classical one. I present them also in the paper, science as a scientific practice in tension with society. What is it? We don't have to go into detail with that. We know that the quality criteria are traditional, caring for objectivity and independency, but we know that science as a practice is influenced by the market, political programs, competition, but also by the ideology of finding and presenting the truth. Scientists will always see uncertainty as something that can be eradicated or minimized or reduced in an objective way. Self-organized quality control through peer review, and we know that all this tends to stimulate things that are not problematic as such, but can, of course, be open for interpretation and manipulation, knowledge brokerage, tailor-made scientific consultancy, and political science shopping. Science, the tensions are always around dealing with uncertainty. And let's not go too much in detail with that. Uncertainty can mean different things. It can mean theory choice. It can mean inconsistent data to support a specific theory. But of course, and foremost, looking into the future and trying to predict the future. What is important is what I just said. Scientists will always see uncertainty as something that can be minimized. So the second, of course, is something that is very familiar to us. It's science as a social practice embedded in society. And then we can quote Chela Jesdanov very easily in that sense. The ways in which we know and represent the world, both nature and society, are inseparable from the ways in which we choose to live in it. Co-production is symmetrical in that it calls attention to the social dimension of cognitive commitments and understandings, while at the same time underscoring the epistemic and material correlates of social formations. Co-production can therefore be seen as a critique of the realist ideology that persistently separates the domains of nature, facts, objectivity, reason, and policy from those of culture, values, subjectivity, emotions, and politics. And interestingly, you can also apply that to uncertainty. She's not doing it per se, but what counts for nature, facts, objectivity, reason, and policy also counts for the fact of scientific uncertainty. The way in which we know and represent scientific uncertainties are inseparable from the ways in which we choose to live with them. In other words, the ways in which we, and the degree to which knowledge supporting a hypothesis is just to be incomplete and or speculative, are relative as they depend on the social dimensions of our cognitive commitments and understandings. If an expert from Monsanto says that Roundup is possibly safe when you use it as prescribed, and an expert working for the World Health Organization says it's possibly causing cancer, then the general public thinks that one of the two is lying. Well, most people will think the guy from Monsanto is lying. But the truth is, of course, that none of the two knows for sure. They have the same set of data, and they apply their preferred hypothesis to it that is really connected to their social role they play as an expert. So, visions on science, we all know them. I listed a number of them, not all of them, of course. Latour, Longino, Gibbons, Nowotny, Jesdanov, Kitcher, Functovis, and Ravets. In my paper, I focus on Kitcher and Functovis and Ravets for a specific reason, because they make explicit calls for a democratization of the generation of knowledge for policy advice, where there is a need to deal with scientific uncertainty and values and issues in need of political action, but also because their motivation to do so is ethical, because they care for a way for some kind of social justice. But one has to recognize that a full democratization of knowledge generation will not necessarily resolve scientific perplexity. In the sense that, as in the case of thyroid cancer in Fukushima or Roundup, it will still be left with a scientific hypothesis that cannot yet be proven. It's not because you organize democracy that you will resolve scientific perplexity like in these cases. So what do we do with this? I think the solution is, and this is my conclusion, that we need to see science as something else still, as the social construction of hypotheses. What I mean with that, it's confronted with the need to deal with incomplete and speculative knowledge and value pluralism in providing policy advice on issues of social well-being. I think the current challenge for science is not the production of credible proofs, it's the construction of credible hypotheses. The hypothesis becoming the end product of science leading a public political life. Not only in the case of Fukushima, but actually in all of the issues of technological risk and social well-being and health we face today. Hypothesis became the end product of science. We cannot keep it into the laboratory until we have full evidence. On the contrary, it is often really sent out in public to play a political function. So in our contemporary society, living with low doses of glyphosate, radioactivity, electromagnetic radiation, fine dust, flame retardants, arsenic, food preservatives, hormone additives, trans fats, sugar, and alcohol is living with the scientific uncertainty troubling the understanding and prediction of their true health effects, whether we like it or not. And of course, science needs to continue to strive for better understanding and prediction, but meanwhile, the hypotheses should be taken care of, instead of leaving them to lead an uncontrolled commercial or political life. And taking care of means that there should be the willingness to deliberate specific interpretations of scientific uncertainty. The overall motivation for this is not a care for the credibility of science itself as such, but the care for fairness and effectiveness and social trust in policy. And I will conclude with the idea of reflexivity as a quality of the science-policy interface. There's only one thing to do for science in these cases. From an ethical perspective and in the general interest of rendering hypotheses with credibility, science has no choice but to open up its methods towards society. Objectivity and independency can still play in the back of our heads, but it's more about recognizing uncertainty, value pluralism, contingency, and potential misuse of science, fostering post-normal science by opening up the scientific method for transdisciplinarity and public involvement, and very important, organizing this kind of scientific assessment as an act of democratic deliberation, embedded in democratic decision-making. And this is my last slide. The aims are threefold. Reflexivity as a quality of the science policy interface, and in my paper, of course, I go much deeper into that, and I also frame it more academically, is three things: trust despite of uncertainty, reflexive policy advice, and ethical values to steer policy. The joint recognition of scientific uncertainty could become a first democratic act in itself. Think about thyroid cancer in Fukushima, think about Roundup. And paradoxically, even in case of controversy, societal trust can emerge with a joint acknowledgement and fair description of scientific perplexity. We discussed with citizens in Fukushima, for instance, and telling them that it's not so easy. I mean, there's no evidence. This is the noise on the signal. This is what you can do with it and what not. And as I said, paradoxically, by telling them that science cannot provide answers yet, they would trust more the system than by people saying conflicting things to them, of course. The second one is pretty obvious as a consequence. When you can deliberate specific interpretations of uncertainty, it would make science more reflexive, as it would enable the discussion and negotiation of the various stakeholders' views. That's also creating transparency, eventually driven by strategic interests. And last but not least, this kind of reflexive science policy interface, I think, is the only authoritative place that would allow a discussion of and a promotion of ethical values such as the precautionary principle. Think of Roundup. I mean, the very simple idea that if we suspect something to be dangerous, then we better don't use it. But of course, the market doesn't work like that. But also other values such as equality, sustainability, and the protection and empowerment of the weak as principles to inspire and steer policy. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm a futurist, and I'm going to present something more or less eerie and weird. I hope the technical problems which will occur during the presentation won't disturb too much, because the content as such is already pretty disturbing. So yeah, I'm going to present Biopunk, Postnormal Immersion, Exacerbation, and Existential Horror. I'm going to explain a little bit further what that means, but I summed it up then as decisive moments in history, similar to the book from Stefan Zweig, Sternstunden der Geschichte, Decisive Moments in History, which point out the particular moments in history which really made a difference. And yes, I will begin with that quote. Do we have sound? Okay. Seen as a whole, cultures remain self-opaque. They dream and poetize themselves rather than that they think themselves. The interplay between fictional narratives, which playfully describe possible imaginary futures, and the direction a culture is taking is a curious case. It is about pre-validation and pre-mediation of the futuristic. We are familiar with the term cyberspace, a consensual hallucination. William Gibson introduced us to it when he published in 1984 one of the best-known works of the cyberpunk genre. Cyberspace was our consensual confabulation. It consumed our attention and left us with nothing more than a deficit of what it consumed. Gibson's opening line back then was, "The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel." In the background, you can see a GIF file from Cronenberg's movie Videodrome. where you can still catch a glimpse of the dead channel color pattern morphing into something else. Our digital information age began by being screen-bound. However, the emerging biodigital fusion sprawls out of the screen. Too loud. Cyberpunk is superseded by biopunk. Biotech and synthetic biology are the key features of this subgenre of science fiction. Hacking biology will challenge our understanding of control, oppression, and what it means to be human. Impact assessments must be reflected in holistically comprehending the effects on societies. Old forms of violence will be transformed in new forms of hostility. In a Cronenbergian sense of bodily fluids, a biopunk world plays with biochemical compounds and organic materials. It does not affect, influence, and manipulate our perception of reality as the digital infrastructure did. Instead, it does exactly what the Anthropocene suggests, fully altering reality as a geological force unleashed. We cannot fully prepare, but we can anticipate. We can combine postnormal theory with the notion of immersion. Immersion in the sense what the Italian philosopher Emanuele Coccia proposes. Immersion allows symbiosis and symbiogenesis. Postnormal immersion might eventually fully equip us with the mindset not to feel paralyzed by the Lovecraftian cosmic existential horror we are about to face, consciously tackling the so-called wicked problems. We know it is a race between education and catastrophe, and we just have to make sure that education doesn't become a catastrophe itself. Postnormal sciences is thus questioning unquestioned assumptions. Unquestioned assumptions are the predominant authority of our time. Any system is designed in such a way to make change impossible. But change has to be made possible to adapt to a world where change is changing, and where we need an urgent temporal extension of imagining decolonized different future alternatives. And I have, of course, the question, where can we find these fringes, signs, and weak signals of the future of the so-called literary genre of biopunk? And I brought you a few examples. So again, I hope it will work in terms of technical things. And I'm not responsible for those transitions. So first of all, endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I think I have to look into that the video starts a little bit later. Can we have it a little bit louder, please? Thank you. Okay.
If you've been listening to the news at all, you've probably heard about the dangerous chemicals that are called endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. Inside our bodies is a network of glands and organs called the endocrine system that produce, store, and secrete hormones. Normally, the hormones go from the gland or organ to the other organs and fit right into specific receptors expressed in cells. Kind of like how a key goes into a lock. But when EDCs get into the body, they can mimic the shape of the hormone, and they go to the receptor instead. They can trick the body into thinking they are a hormone, or block the hormone from fitting into its receptor. Fooling a cell in this way can trigger abnormal processes in the body. This can wreak havoc on the entire endocrine system and may lead to severe health consequences. EDCs have been linked to human health issues related to sperm quality, fertility, abnormalities in sex organs, endometriosis, early puberty, nervous system function, immune function, cancers, breathing problems, metabolic issues, obesity, heart health, growth, neurological and learning disabilities, and more, because hormones regulate nearly every process in the body. What's worrisome is that exposure to EDCs can happen anywhere and come from the air we breathe, the food we eat, and the water we drink, and through the skin. Some EDCs even transfer from mothers to fetuses and infants. They can be found in industrial chemicals that leach into soil and groundwater, and then make their way into the food chain to build up in fish, animals, and people. Consumer products such as plastics, household chemicals, fabrics treated with flame retardants, cosmetics, lotions, products with fragrance, and antibacterial soaps.
So I think you get the point. And so far as what my information, regarding my information, SweetTalk's a Swedish example is apparently the only government institution which really focuses on that issue. And here we see also like something interesting that by 2020, their prerequisites for protecting human health and the environment from harmful chemicals will be in place. And I think that's also something which we saw yesterday regarding the timelines in case of Shell. When something is too far away in 2050, it's just too abstract. We need to bring it into actionable space and have to have a feeling of urgency and immediacy in order to act upon it. So I think that's a prime example or a good example how to deal with the situation. Another strange aspect. Right.
Like researchers found it to build robots with those same.
Okay.
And they're now using this discovery to build robots with those same extraordinary powers. Putting the American cockroach through a series of obstacle courses, the researchers found that even though its shell or exoskeleton, allowing the roach to flatten itself all the way down to just a quarter of its height. The experiments showed these roaches can withstand almost 900 times their body weight without getting hurt. That's like an average person being crushed by more than 123,000 pounds. Not only that, even in their squished state, the American cockroaches were still able to run super fast, nearly 20 times their body length per second. Inspired by this awesome skill set, the researchers built CRAM, a compressible robot with articulated mechanisms. The prototype has a segmented, pliable shell, and like the cockroach, CRAM is able to sprawl out and run using other parts of its legs instead of its feet.
So in case of what that means in the future, we could look at something like Starship Troopers, which already illustrated that in a very fictional way. So right now, families in Pakistan or in Syria, they are afraid of the buzzing sound in the sky of predator drones firing hellfire missiles on them. Maybe in the future it will be the crawling, creepy sound of insectoids attacking them. So I think that's also kind of weird and disturbing. So another example I brought also from this biopunk world is the Saharan silver ant. And here the research points out that this so it's, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's an ant in the desert, which basically through its surface of being silver, and you see here the construction silver ant and how it looks like, can basically maintain kind of high heat. And here the suggestion is this biological solution for a thermoregulatory problem may lead to the development of biomimetic coatings for passive radiative cooling of objects. And the magical number in case of humans is 42 degrees, then our bodies shut down. So in case of further climate warming, this is something to consider, and let's see how it will further progress and evolve. So maybe it wasn't the fly which Cronenberg had to direct, but it should have been the ant. Gene editing in human embryos is apparently now going on in Japan, and here we see in China, and UK also applied for a license to edit genes in human embryos. So how about that? So in regard of human enhancement, if we already create probably in the near future designer babies, it's not only about hair color or eye color or size, but it might actually be about the peak performance, at which age we are able to do what in terms of vocabulary and information we still have, like this is the age, but a lot of things where we have peak performances, it's very early, and probably they will work on that. But I'm not suggesting here some anthropocentric point of view, but more or less like a holistic point of view. So we should certainly take into consideration that we are, like, as I said earlier, in symbiosis with the world. So, and biopunk should therefore also be approached in a more thoughtful way. And I just recently, that's just what I added here currently. It was a really good podcast from Russell Brand, interview with Gabor Amate, Damaged Leaders, Rule an Addicted World. And I think we should move from that kind of paradigm in which we are still stuck towards something more or less where we reconceptualize royalty, in that sense that we should really emphasize on the importance that our mindsets are more about healing each other, healing this world, and healing our relationships with each other in terms of our interpersonal relationships, the reciprocal arrangement of mutual learning with each other, from each other. And I think this is just a little bit cliche, I have to admit, but it's important to point out nevertheless, because without this biodiversity and without the atmosphere, when we completely wreck it up, it's kind of obvious what will happen, I think. So another aspect, I can also sum up quite quickly. So what I'm personally interested in is the evolution of cultural governance, and I'm just at the beginning of it. So using also biomimicry, examples from nature, where we can really affect and impact cultural governance, because obviously we are already consciously, unconsciously, subconsciously, non-consciously impacting evolution itself. So we should maybe also focus on our governmental structures in such a way that they also evolve further. And I'm looking particularly at autophagy, so self-devouring systems in order to heal the body. And that will be interesting also for governmental structures, because we saw yesterday, again with the Shell case, as long as the business model of Shell doesn't change, Shell will be doing exactly what they have been doing all these years. And the transformation within is kind of, in my case, in my point of view, improbable, as long as we don't use better organizational architecture. Yes. So essentially my message is moving from biopunk to biointelligence, utilizing biomimicry, biomorphism, biomanufacturing, and not havocing the world as we did so far in the Newtonian, predetermined, mechanistic kind of mindset we are still having in place, but building big things and stuff like that. Yes, thank you.